Thank you, Neil, for those very many and very generous words. Happily, in the work of our distinguished guests, David Hockney speaks for itself. For more than 20 years, ever since he left his native Yorkshire at the age of 21, David Hockney has been engaged on a remarkable voyage of discovery, a vivid journey in which he has explored the world of imagination and memory, as well as the world that we know. It's a very real pleasure for you to join us tonight, David. I wonder if you could start by telling us just how important your travels have been to your work.
Travels. Well, I was taught early on that it's the journey that counts, not the destination, which I think is true. And well, I think they've been important. If you come from a tiny little island and the moment you realise it's not very big, you tend to want to travel. I think the English like travelling. And but I didn't start till I was 21 when I first left England. And ever since I've been a gypsy, really.
Could you have remained close to home and have accomplished the same things in your life and in your work?
Well, I think it would have been hard, actually. I think, well, in a way, you remain close to your home. If you didn't leave it for 20 years and you go away. I mean, I always look at Southern California because for 20 years you spent your life in a rather black, rainy, dismal city with low clouds over it all the time. Consequently, Southern California looks a special place to me. If you were born here, obviously, maybe you look at it differently. But that's because you take your home away with you. We do.
Why don't we begin by describing the place that you were born? Will you describe Yorkshire for us? What's the landscape like compared, for example, to your surroundings here in California?
Well, it's extremely green compared to California. But the cities, the industrial cities, are really very ugly. When I lived in Bradford, it was still mostly a Victorian city. Then they hadn't done any, they didn't start pulling things down till about 1955, I think, 10 years after all. And it's changed quite a bit now. It looks like the middle of Cologne or anywhere else, actually. But the countryside is very beautiful. It's a lot of parts of it are very pastoral, parts of it are very wild looking. I mean, the moors are very wild. Just a few miles away is, you can walk there from where we lived, is Howard, where the Brontes wrote their novels. And the moors above there, they seem, in a way, once you've walked a few miles into them, they seem as wild and as remote as Death Valley does.
How do you think your work might have been different if you remained on that tight little island?
Well, I think it's hard to get into colour if you live there. The English are not great colourists, because unless they leave, when they leave, they're better, because you don't see any colour. I think it's they're very good at greys. A lot of grey.
Are you suggesting that your palette has changed since you moved here?
Yeah. Oh, it did. Yeah, it did. I mean, at first it got simply brighter. I mean, there were pastel colours at first. But then it got stronger and stronger. Yeah, it's the light and what you see around you, does it?
What brought you to California for the first time?
I came here on a hunch, in a way. Just a hunch that I'd like it. I'd never been before. I went to New York in 1961, and I thought that was wonderful. But somehow or other, I had this vision of California from the movies. I suppose a lot of it was from movies, actually. And but you never quite knew what it looked like, because the movies don't really tell you what it looks like. Oddly enough, they make all the movies here, but they never really, hardly any movies tell you what Los Angeles is like. But I kept seeing pictures of palm trees and things, and I thought, that sounds like the place for me. And I came here once, the first time I came here, I just came, I thought I'd come and paint for a year. I thought I had enough money to live for a year without doing anything else, and I thought I'll go to California. And people tried to put me off. In New York, they tried to put me off, especially Los Angeles. And I couldn't drive. They said, if you can't drive, you can't get anywhere. And I said, oh, it doesn't matter. I should buy a bicycle, which I did.
Is that how you got around it
I learned to
first?
drive. But the hunch was right. Somehow it was, when I came here, it was the first time I ever started looking at the place you lived in. You see, in London, I was put off London painting it because every English art student was painting London, and they always painted it in a certain style, in a way, that was derived from Sickert. I don't know whether you know an English artist, Sickert,
Yes.
and that style derived from Degas and Lautrec, in a way. But there were too many ghosts, you see, and I thought, well, in California there won't be any. Even I've never seen any pictures of Los Angeles. I don't know.
Has
Nobody's
your
given me a
idea of
clue.
Los Angeles changed since you've come to live here? And now that you're looking at it so continually and seriously?
Well, it's always fresh looking to me, always interesting. Architectural, it's forever interesting. Even you can smile at architecture here. I like that. Well, it's changed. In some ways, it's changed. For instance, when I lived, this was recent change. I noticed this. When I lived in Santa Monica, or I lived on Pico Boulevard, everything was straight lines and cubes to me in Los Angeles. Mostly, those were the forms that you saw. And then I went to live up on Mulholland Drive, and suddenly, every day I drove down Nichols Canyon to paint on Santa Monica Boulevard, and suddenly, wiggly lines
So your work
occurred,
has
and
been affected by your move to the hills.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that there were always these wiggly lines if you drive on Mulholland Drive. And suddenly then I began to notice that Los Angeles, you looked at it a bit like a map. It was also, I suddenly realized it was a city that everybody knows very well from the air, which is unusual in a sense that most people who travel in here, even if you come from San Francisco or San Diego, people fly in and you see the city very clearly when you fly in, even at night. You can recognize the streets. You can say that's Wilshire Boulevard or something. Well, you can't do that in a lot of other cities. Even in New York, you couldn't say that's Fifth Avenue. You can't look and you see it's Manhattan. In London, you can see landmarks, but you can't really say, oh, that's Kensington High Street. You can't do that. And I think then I realized, oh, it's another view. You can have another view completely of this city. And I started, at the moment, because I was painting on Santa Monica Boulevard, I painted a picture of Nichols Canyon. I painted a long picture of Mulholland Drive. And then I realized they were views from Santa Monica Boulevard, essentially. So now I want to paint them up there and see what happens. So you get another view of it then.
With all this enthusiasm, is it correct to assume that you consider yourself a Californian now?
Well, I've been here more than 3 months. If you've been here more than 3 months.
You qualify. We know that you're fascinated by the sun, but there is also a part of you that is drawn to the more gloomy environment of your upbringing. How does that get reflected in your work?
Well, I used to say it was, yes, the Mediterranean sun attracted me, and Gothic gloom. because I was brought up in Gothic gloom, really. You know, as I say, Bradford, it's a Victorian Gothic city, but outside of Bradford are all kind of Gothic ruins, you know.
It's not very far from London, though.
Well, it is and it isn't. It's 200 miles, but when I was a child, we didn't know anybody who'd been to London. It's a long way. My mother was 63 years old when she first visited London.
And your father?
My father went in the general strike, 1926, and he'd never been again.
Can we talk about your family for a moment? They are obviously very central, as one might imagine, to your life and your work. And in a rather generous way, you have used a term to describe your father that has a special meaning to you, and the word that you used to describe him was eccentric. I wonder if you can tell us what you mean by that phrase and how you were influenced by him.
Well, he was eccentric. I mean, I found that out because he was rather different from most other people on the street, or most other people's parents that I met. But he was also, like all eccentric people, they're very self-centered, of course. And he kind of lived in a world of his own. I mean, in the end, he was a bit deaf, and again, perhaps that drives you into a world, more a world of your own. But he was, his behaviour was eccentric in the sense that...
How did it manifest itself?
Well,
that in a way both influenced you, and I assume in some ways intimidated you, and in some ways liberated you.
Well, for instance, all I can do is illustrate with some stories. For instance, when I was... you have to remember, it's a very cold, dark place, but very cold, you know. And I must have been 8 or 9 years old. I'm walking down the street, and there's a telephone box near a school. And outside the telephone box there's a man sat in a chair, an easy chair, which is not a usual sight, you see. But as I got closer, I saw it was my father. So actually I said, well, what? It just looked as though he'd taken a bit of the living room and pushed it way up the street. And I said, well, why are you sitting here? And he said, oh, he was going to sell the billiard table. And he'd put in an ad in the newspaper to ring this number between 5:30 and 6, and it was the telephone box. He didn't have a phone, and rather than stand outside the phone box, thought he'd have to be there half an hour, so he'd actually wheeled.
Sounds very practical. Did
yeah,
he manage
well,
to
then
sell the
I
billiard
thought-
table?
I thought, well, it all made sense to me, and then I carried on, and that was it. But it was explainable perfectly rationally. And I thought, well, it's a good idea. That's what I'd do, actually. And everybody else would think, oh, it's a bit daft. And, you know, they would have hid behind the phone box or something. And I don't know, there's hundreds of things. Really. He, I think, actually, would have liked to have been an artist, really.
What was his occupation? Was he an artist
Well,
at any time himself?
He did many jobs. No, he was never really an artist. I mean, the last few years of his life, he was a clerk. But he did study art and at night school, at the art school in Bradford when he was young, because he must have studied it in a very, very, you know, old-fashioned academic way, because, again, if you remember when the Royal Academy was selling their Leonardo drawing, do you remember a few years ago they sold it to the National Gallery? Very beautiful drawing of a Virgin and Child. And it was reproduced in all the newspapers. And when my father saw it, he said, oh, yeah, I know that. He said, I've done that. It's called Light and Shade. And he used to take lessons in light and shade at art school, which I often think about afterwards, because I think, frankly, it's probably...
Pretty
They
good
never do
time,
it now.
yes.
They would never do it now, but to learn about chiaroscuro is probably extremely good thing. In fact, I noticed in the Picasso show in New York, the first drawing, the first thing in the show was a drawing of a plaster cast that obviously he'd made. His father taught drawing, didn't he? And would have taught things like that. And I noticed how good he was
As a draftsman.
at grasping volume through shade, through light and shade, which he must have been taught. And then you realise how it runs all the way through his work, all how his cubism, where you used in analytic cubism, chiaroscuro, the idea, he used it better than Braque, I think. Again, it's somehow, I don't know, I suddenly thought they should do light and shade classes again. That's what I thought.
Were you really introduced to painting because of one of the jobs that he held? I'm thinking of when you helped him to repair those bicycles.
The bicycles. Well, he used to paint just after the war. You couldn't buy any new things in England, bicycles. So if you wanted a bicycle, there was a large trade in second-hand bicycles. And he used to paint them. And they looked exactly like new bicycles to me, because he put silver paint on the wheels, and he put... and he used to paint the lines on the handlebars, on the crossbar. And I used to watch that, and I do remember, you know, you can do it with those special lining brushes, and you rest your finger on the top, and you can draw a perfect straight line, and I thought that was marvellous to watch. And but the pleasure of actually putting brushes in paint and doing things with them, I think is a physical pleasure as well, isn't it? I mean, I do enjoy that. Even if you're just painting a wall or something. There's something
The gesture as well.
yeah, there's something nice about it.
When and how did you first decide to become an artist?
How did I first decide? Well, I think I always wanted to be an artist.
Did you ever consider any career other than that of being a painter?
Not really, no.
Never.
Well, I did... you see, when I left school, and I went to art school when I was 16 years old, and which you could do then. And I wanted, at first my parents wouldn't really let me go to art school. They said, you should get a job, and couldn't you get a job doing posters or something like that? That's something you should do. And I went round trying to get a job, but of course I wasn't too keen on getting a job. I wanted to go to the art school, so I didn't try very hard. And the moment somebody said, you need a bit more training, that's the words I took back to my mother, and said, well, they said I have to have some more training, so I'll have to go.
She accepted that.
Yeah.
As someone for whom travel has become so important, you didn't leave Yorkshire until the age of 21. What was the very first voyage that you took?
Well, the first voyage I took was to London. I was 18 years old when I first went to London. I went on the train and hitchhiked back. Then I used to hitchhike up just to look at I went to see the National Gallery and the Tate Gallery, the museums, that's all. I mean, really that meant you were looking at real paintings for the first time. I mean, modern paintings anyway. In Yorkshire, there's quite a few things to see. In the art gallery in Bradford, they were mostly Victorian pictures. In Leeds, they had a better collection. A few Rembrandts as well. Then in houses round about, Harewood House or they had Titians, Old Masters, but I'd never seen any. I don't think I'd seen a real Picasso, you see, until then. So I wanted to go and see them. And then after that, then I kept going down. I'd go for 2 days, just hitchhike. I mean, it's a very provincial town, Bradford, you have to realise. Although it's quite big, it is provincial in its what is there. There was a lot of music, always a lot of music, but not much visual art.
Water is a recurring theme in your work, and there is quite an incident when you first saw the sea. Perhaps you would tell us the circumstances of that vision and what your response to it was.
The sea. Ah, yeah. Well, I first saw the sea. I was bay, and if you can see across the bay, you see the mountains of the southern part of the English Lake District. But in my excitement to think it was abroad, I wanted it to be France. I'd forgotten the geography, really. And it was a thrilling experience, because it's quite late on, isn't it, to get a first glimpse of a rather large piece of water. I mean, there are no big lakes in England, where you can't see anything else on the other side. A strong horizontal with nothing there. I mean, it's quite a powerful effect. But if you, and I can remember the effect. If you were probably 1 year old, you wouldn't quite remember it, unless you dig about.
In addition to water, glass and mirrors seem to be recurring themes as well. Are there any special features that these reflective surfaces have for you?
Well, they're always fascinating. I mean, what's fascinating about, say, glass or water is they're hard to describe. They're hard to describe verbally, and they're hard to describe pictorially, really. And I think that's what fascinated me, really. I mean, also, it's, you see, both glass and water, it's the most simple way you can see what your eyes can actually do. I mean, you can decide where you're going to look, which of course I discovered afterwards you can do anywhere. You can do it here. But on glass or water, it's very clear. I mean, you can, on a window, for example, everybody knows that your eyes, you can focus them to look at the surface, or you can look through it. And if you look through it, you don't see the surface, it disappears. Suddenly the little spots you'd been looking at have gone. Well, it's like that, actually, I think, in almost any way. It's just finding out about how you actually look at something. So I think that was the interest originally. I'd always liked, there's a poem, I think I quoted it in the book about glass. In fact, it's not just a poem, it used to be a hymn, I think. I used to sing it at school. But the words had always, I thought, were really good. A man may look on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and there the heaven espy. That's George Herbert, but it's the same thing, isn't it? And somehow I like the idea of that. And so a swimming pool, you see, water in a swimming pool, they say more interesting than water, the sea. The sea is another kind of image, completely powerful force, isn't it? Water in a swimming pool is a little hedonistic pond, and you look at it another way. But it's fascinating how you look at it, what you really see in it. And photography has great difficulty with it, I think, because if you disturb water in a swimming pool and then photograph it, what you get is something that you didn't see at all. I mean, you get a frozen 60th of a second of lines moving about, but it looks solid in a way. It's unrealistic, actually. That's my point. Well, like a lot of photography, it's unrealistic. But in painting, of course, you can make movement much better because you've got time on your side to do it. So anyway, it's constantly fascinating. I mean, usually each time I've gone back to painting water and pools, I've done it a different way each time. Every few years I go back to it and suddenly look at it in a different way, really. Suddenly find there's maybe just the surface and what it reflects interests you, or a bit of both, how you deal with both or something. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it will fascinate me all the time, really. I mean, when I get a bit bored with it, I could paint something else, but I keep going back to it. I find myself drawn back to it. I haven't really started on glass yet, but I think I will somehow deal with it.
In the 1960s, on one of your early voyages, you traveled to Switzerland. However, in that journey, you spent the entire journey in the back of a van. Yet you managed to document the trip. Perhaps you might tell us what you did and just how important, and why you chose to spend that trip in the back of a van, and just how important memory is to your work.
Well, I didn't choose the back of the van. I was just put there. Can I smoke here?
Yes.
No, I can't.
You can,
Do you have
can't
an
you?
ashtray? It was my first trip to Italy. We were really going to Italy. And I was with a young American who'd just come to Europe for the first time. And somebody who taught at the Royal College of Art said he was going to Switzerland and he'd give us a lift to Switzerland if we'd share the price of the petrol. So we said, that's all right, that would be good. Unfortunately, it was this tiny little van, and I felt I really should let Farrell have the front seat because this was his first trip, and maybe he might not go again. And anyway, I thought in my polite way that's what I should. And I was really looking forward to seeing the mountains of Switzerland. I thought, this is Gothic, true Gothic landscape, not building. And I thought, I want to make something of that, really. I'm sure they're going to be thrilling. Well, unfortunately, I missed all the best parts because you don't see anything if you're trying to lean over. It was terrible, really. That's why I have a convertible car now.
Not going to miss
see
anything.
more, you can see more and feel more as well. More.
How did you document the trip?
Well, when we then he dropped us off in Bern, and then we took the train to Florence. But I was keen to make a picture of it, and so naturally all you can do is deal with the experience. So I made up the mountains from a geography book. Some of them have layers of things. I thought that's the only way I'm seeing them at the moment. And I had one postcard with a painting of a mountain with snow, which I put in between. I just wedged one little view, which I thought reflected just the little view I got, you see. Otherwise, it was conceptual, really. It was done from books and from an idea of it, really. On the other hand, I think it authentically described the experience. But I put myself in the van, and I'm cramped up in the van, so you could see that it was about difficulty of seeing something you'd really been building up, and I'm sure it wouldn't have let me. Well, it doesn't. I've been since many times. It doesn't let you down. It's rather breathtaking landscape, isn't it?
In the past year, I believe, you returned from yet another voyage, and this time it was to China. What did you see there that inspired you, and did you do any work while you were there or since that draws upon that experience?
Well, visually, China wasn't that inspiring to me, just as a visual experience. But as another kind of experience it was. I mean, wonderful, really. But I did some drawings, but first I found it very hard because they really push you around. There were only 3 of us, and we went from place to place to place to place to place to place, quickly have some food, another place to place to place. And so I was hoping to have a little half hour here or 15 minutes there, and then I couldn't do that, and I thought, well, obviously the Chinese always work from memory when they do drawings. They don't, very rarely do they sit outside. So I thought, obviously that's what I'm going to have to do with it. And then anyway, I'd taken just a little camera. I didn't have a very good camera, but I thought, well, I can't draw all the time. It's just too much, this. And so I'll take a lot of photographs. So I did take a lot of photographs I thought that I would then draw when I got back.
Is that the sort of work you generally do when you're traveling?
But I found actually that with the drawings I did there and the photographs, the experience is documented, and I think if I do them here, it's not quite, they're not, when I try and do them from the photographs, they're not as interesting. Even the tiny, slightest sketches I did in the hotels at night from memory are better, because they have more feeling about them, I think. So we're going to make a book, and I'm just sorting it out, really.
In your very early work, you incorporated another kind of documentation, and that is written messages that went along with a visual image. What made you decide to use words in those works?
Well, I used words a long time ago because the reason was I wanted to make things clear.
Didn't you think we'd get it?
Well, clarity in this way, though. I meant at the time I'd just started at Royal College of Art, and everybody was painting abstract expressionist pictures, or should I say, not everybody, what you would call the advanced students, I suppose. There were always little girls who painted flowers in pots, or the view of the V&A roofs from the window. Every art school in England, there's people like that doing those. But and so for a short while, I tried my hand at abstract expressionism, but we didn't. I couldn't actually find how to deal with the subject. Well, I know some abstract expressionists did, but I couldn't. I didn't figure it out. It just seemed to me therapy. I mean, lovely work you're doing with the brush, but it just seemed a kind of therapeutic art. And so I wanted to find subjects. And my friend R.B. Kitter had said, I'm always talking, you're always talking a lot about things. Paint what you think about and feel and see. So I did, and I started painting pictures of about Gandhi, about vegetarianism, and I'd put in words to just make things clear. Later on, I decided the reason for doing it, there's a few reasons for doing it. You make people scrutinize the surface of the painting. Again, it's like the glass. You focus in on one way, then you focus another, you see. And this dawned on me, and of course then you realize the Cubists had done that. They had used that technique. And I then began to think that really it was figures I wanted there. And I just thought that you couldn't put figures in abstract expressionist pictures. This was not done. Well, after a while I didn't care, but just for a month or two you thought, this is breaking the rules, you can't do that. So actually slowly, you notice the writing got smaller when the figures got bigger. And I like the idea. There was one painting, for instance, I did about 1962, I think. It's called A Painting Emphasizing Stillness. And all the painting was of a leopard leaping across the canvas, and two little men and a semi-detached house down here. And there was a tiny line of type that when you got close up to the painting, you could read it, and it said, "They are perfectly safe. This is a still." Which afterwards I thought was naughty because it was taking away the magic that you could think about. Is that leopard going to eat the two little men? What's it doing? And anyway, it's a giant leopard. I mean, many things. And but it was only when you got close to the painting, when you actually, in fact, you had to be quite close to read it. And that was my way of suggesting that maybe the surface isn't everything in the painting.
You've described yourself as a literalist, and you have been described as one who makes sermonettes. Is that fair or accurate?
Well, it's Henry Geltzal that says I give, sometimes
He
they're
does.
sermons, he says, and sometimes they're sermonettes. Well, I talk too much at times, sometimes.
No.
Oh, this burn.
Why don't we put some water in it? How's that?
Yeah.
Put it in the
Sorry.
water.
I was drinking that water.
Well, let's give you this one to drink
Oh, I
and this
see.
one to put the cigarette in. How's that? You didn't burn yourself, though, did you?
No.
How about drinking from this one, though, and I'll move this one away. Do you care for water?
Yeah, well, that's
How much of what occurs in a painting is the result of necessity? I'm thinking of one of your pictures entitled Man Taking a Shower. And you've said that the reason that feet are not pictured is that you did not know how to do feet. Have you since learned?
Well, I could do feet, but they're difficult, that's all. The point was I said that because I thought if I don't say it, somebody else will say it. Because it's so obvious.
So you cover the feet with a plant.
I did cover the feet, yeah. I mean, it's just, after all, it's something lots of artists do at times. But I knew it was a bit of a cop-out, and I should have struggled a little bit and drawn the feet. But,
So there's no such thing as an accident in painting.
no, not really, no.
When did you start to paint faces?
To paint faces. Well, when I was at art school in Bradford, I drew and painted faces. Not very well. I've always been interested in faces and portraits. I like doing portraits. Generally, well, when I say I like doing portraits, I wouldn't really do. I've hardly ever done any commission portraits, and it doesn't really interest me. Because if I don't know the people, I find it's often very hard to know what somebody really looks like if you don't know them. Very hard, I find. I have to draw them a lot. And it takes you a while to really look into the face.
Is that how you begin the making of a portrait, by drawing a lot?
Mm.
Do you ever use photographs?
Sometimes, but photographs, sometimes you take photographs to help me in painting. Photographs to help you in drawing is awful, I think. I think they're not much use, really. And I don't like drawing and I hardly ever make drawings from photographs, very, very rare. There's usually not enough information of the kind you need in photography, I find. I mean, space, how the volume is something in space, very hard to get from photographs, I think.
What is the difference, beside that which is obvious, between taking a picture and painting a picture?
You mean making a photograph? Well, God, if you want me to start on photography, see,
I do. That's exactly what I'm prompted to.
I'll tell you, I
do.
take thousands of photographs myself. On the other hand, I think it's a small medium. It's easy, really. I mean, all you need is an eye, and a lot of people have quite good eyes, a lot of people. In drawing, you need a bit more than an eye. You need a hand, and you need I think you need feelings. Well, you're doing photography, but the problems with photography, it seems to me, is you never see things really like that. You don't. They're not true. It's just not true. It's like verisimilitude. It's always the same problem. You see, in European art, there's always the pull of verisimilitude. Always. I mean, and it's only in European art it seems to happen, isn't it? It doesn't happen in Chinese art, Japanese art. And in fact, I had an interesting theory. I don't know whether this is true or not. It occurred to me that, after all, the camera was invented in the 16th century, 17th century, 16th century. The camera obscura. After all, photography is simply the old camera obscura with a chemical process added to it, isn't it? So the camera is older than photography. And Canaletto used it. That's what we would call photorealist paintings, aren't they? Now, when you look through a camera obscura, you're looking with one eye. It's this one fixed eye. And my point was, when the Europeans thought art had got in a bad way, say 1850 in France, and what is wrong? Why is it lifeless? Why is it unrealistic? And frankly, a lot of their solutions, after all, came from outside of Europe. They came from Japan and China. I mean, the influence of Japan on Van Gogh's is very, very strong. It's underplayed now at the moment, but it is very strong if you look into it. And what he often describes himself in letters as Japanese. I noticed that it occurred to me that perhaps the Japanese had never had the camera obscura. And not until it was opened up in 1850 did maybe the camera come to Japan or China, which would have meant this idea of verisimilitude didn't interest them. They knew it wasn't the truth in a way. Somehow, it's the history of art from that time is always against verisimilitude, which I think is good, actually, because I do think, I mean, I like Canaletto's pictures, I love it,
But the life and work of Van Gogh continue to inspire you. Is there, in addition to both of you following the sun in the same compelling way, what is it in his work or his philosophy or his aesthetic to which you especially respond?
He said people he suspected would be happier in the sun. He's right, they are. And he too came from a rather grim northern city, a kind of Protestant puritanical background, didn't he? And he thought people would live freer, more human probably in the sun, or that's the way he found it. He liked it. I don't know, I think that's a strong pull, actually. I find it so. I mean, I suddenly realized in reading, I was reading the letters about 2 years ago, a lot of the letters, and I suddenly realized why he chose to go to those places. And his pictures are always happy. All his pictures, all of the last 3 years anyway, the great masterpieces, they're always actually happy. Even if he wasn't, they are. And I suspect actually he was never as unhappy as people have you believe. He must have been happy painting the pictures. Nor was he poor in any real sense. I don't think, he never describes himself as poor in his letters. And I think he was too sensitive a man to have done that because he'd seen how poor people lived. the miners in Belgium. And he knew he was rich compared to them. So he wouldn't, you know, and that's what I say, seems in many ways self-contained and interesting, and obviously absolutely happy when he's interpreting his experiences in some way. And I think what's incredibly remarkable as well about Van Gogh, when I read the letters, I think if you took the last 3 years of his work, which after all are all a great paintings, how many there are, how many drawings there are, and how many letters he wrote in the evenings. If you put those hours together, the only other time he had left was for sleeping, practically. He had no love affairs in his last 3 years. So, in a way, probably those 3 years of his life are the best documented account of a man's feelings and thinking than anybody else. You think, I keep trying to think, who else would have documented it in that way with such intensity in 3 years? I mean, not even, you think of people who wrote diaries, you think of people who, like, say, Wagner might have, or writing the music, but he didn't keep, it's not every day, every moment. I thought that was marvellous, and it's part of the wonderful generosity of the art, isn't it? That it's shared, and of course all the experience is still with us. It's completely
By
alive.
the life and work of what other artists do you most respond? Has Picasso been an enormous influence on you?
Well, yeah, I love Picasso. I mean, to me, Picasso's the kind of giant artist, absolutely giant artist that you have to, you know, you have to think of Rembrandt or anybody else like that to compare him to them. I think we don't quite know yet really how good it was. You see, I'm now looking at the late Picasso, which after all was pretty put down by what you call the serious art world. They took very little notice of it. Thought it was, I don't know, I mean, I remember going to see, in 1973, the year he died, I went to see the exhibition in Avignon. I went with Douglas Cooper, who after all is a famous Picasso scholar and a very good eye. He's an interesting man. And we went, and he's telling me it's all rubbish. And I said, well, I don't believe it. I want to look at them carefully, Douglas. You've been before. I'm going to look at them all carefully. And certainly at first some of them looked unbelievably slapdash. They looked, but slowly and slowly I began to realise very few artists have ever had that kind of freedom he had in the last years. He didn't give a damn about anybody else painting anywhere else. He didn't care what anybody said. One day he did a painting in thin paint, the next day it's thick paint, completely different thing. They're incredible paintings. As more I look into them, they couldn't have been done without cubism. They're all from his previous, they're unlike his early work, they're not repetitive. There's wonderful, wonderful things in them, marvellous subjects, perfectly ordinary subjects. Almost all of them the figure, always the figure. Sometimes the whole canvas seems the figure. There's no room for anything else, and you don't care about anything else. I mean, that's amazing to me, to make the whole square canvas seem like a human being. There's, I mean, Rembrandt could do it, but he used, after all, the old method of just a dark background, and somehow you just sense the figure. But Picasso doesn't. I think they just get better and better to me, and I think at the moment they're still seriously underrated. But I think people will look at them, start looking at them. We haven't really looked at them. I mean, I've got the Zervos books where you can look at them in black and white, but you know, after all, some of the colour he used in the last years, it was marvellous, mad colour. the range of subjects is staggering, just staggering. And I suddenly, I think, there's nobody else actually does anything like that. In the 60s, you look at all the painting he did in the 60s, better than most things done anywhere else. Absolutely. And we weren't looking, nobody was looking at them at all, I thought. I mean, even in New York, Bill Rubin told me, he was showing me at the Museum of Modern Art, this was the last great painting Picasso did, and that was 1938 or something, he's telling me. He said, no, he said he thought it was the last masterpiece, not the last great painting. And anyway, I said, well, I don't care about, I mean, he did so much work, what do you care about, you know, whether, I know there's some masterpieces, but anyway, I pointed out one I thought was a masterpiece later, and that was, if you remember, the picture of the mother teaching the child to walk, painted in 1942 or 3. Wonderful painting. The subject, unbelievably rare. You've never seen it before. Frankly, Henry, I pointed that out to Henry, and he said, well, Rembrandt must have done it. Sure enough, we find a Rembrandt drawing of a mother teaching a child to walk.
How important is the rare subject matter?
How important is?
The rare subject matter to you?
Well, when I said that's rare subject matter, it's rare, but after all, it's unbelievably ordinary. It's of the most ordinary experience that any human being can relate to. They were all taught to walk, or they've watched somebody else being. I mean, do you know the painting?
Yes, I do.
Wonderful painting. It's got her hands are all supple. The child's hands are like this. It can't do anything. It's got worry and anxiety on his face, yet thrill at doing something. One foot's landed on the ground, one foot's wobbling about. It's incredible what there is in it. There's nothing in the painting about his clothes. There's nothing in the painting about the surfaces of them. It's all about the mother and the child and what they're doing. Fantastic, I think. Nobody else has done anything like it. And Matisse, after all, is a wonderful painter, but he could not paint a family with tenderness the way Picasso could. He just didn't have the range of Picasso could paint very, very tenderly with great feeling of people, couldn't he? Matisse never painted his family.
Have you attempted to paint your family?
Well, yes, I keep trying. Yeah, I mean, Picasso makes us all tiny. I keep trying. Yeah, I want to. I mean, my family, in a way I do. I mean, my family on the whole, I mean, everybody's family is your friends as well, aren't they? The people who you have around you. I tend to draw the same people all the time because they're there, because I'm not going to worry about a likeness. You think you'll just find it, it just comes. You know, there's many things why you do it. But
how important to you in your own work and in your own life has poetry been? I think it's unusual to take a poem that is based on the work of another artist and translate it quite literally into a painting, something that you have done. Whatever made you decide to take such a step?
Well, I think poetry at times is very close to painting. I mean, can be very close to painting. And I've always...
Here we're thinking of the Wallace Stevens poem, not the one that you cited earlier.
Yeah. No, but I mean, great deal of poetry is close to painting, it seems to me. I've always read poetry. Poetry turned me on when I was very young. I kept reading it and thinking, ooh, he knows more than other people. Somehow, I think the poet somehow knows, he's observed more. And I think when I read the Wallace Stevens poem, you see, I didn't know, Wallace Stevens is not very well known in England, really. He's in one or two anthologies, but it's not like he is in America, although I've since found out he's not that well known in America. I thought he was very famous. But the poem, when I read that poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar, I was absolutely bowled over. I've never heard of the poem. I read it through once to myself and thought, it's fantastic. I'm not quite sure what it's about, but it's fantastic. Then I read it through loud to somebody else. And then it was even more interesting because, of course, when you read it loud, you got all the wonderful words it picked, like that were like guitars. I mean, all the internal rhymes you get, and you didn't notice when you don't read it that way. And I got so turned on that I started making some paintings vaguely about it. I mean, you just started in a vague way, you know, and then eventually I abandoned the paintings, but I made it up as etchings. The themes of the poem are wonderful. I mean, in the end, its main theme is that imagination is everything.
Is
And
it?
I think I really believe that. Yeah, I think I do, actually. Without it, there's you can't. I'm not sure what you can grasp. It must be. It must be.
You
And
mentioned...
failure of imagination, after all, is one of our great problems in the world, isn't it? I would think so. I think it's always failure of imagination is terrible.
You mentioned earlier your interest in photography and now poetry. And in the earlier part of our conversation, you said there wasn't much art around in Yorkshire, but there was a great deal of music. Was much of it church-related?
Yes, well, of course, in England there's a lot of church-related music, but there was a lot of orchestras, the Halley Orchestra and the Yorkshire Symphony Orchestra. So there were a lot of concerts. You could actually go to a lot of concerts.
Did you?
Yes, my musical education was live music and concert hall, yeah.
Did you ever study music?
No, I don't know anything about music.
And you don't play a musical instrument?
No.
Obviously, what I'm leading up to is you have described yourself as an amateur about music, yet in the last several years you managed to collaborate both with John Dexter and James Levine of the Metropolitan Opera and created a number of works. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis and evolution of those projects?
Well, I love music. I did say that, didn't I? I mean, I love it. I listen to it a lot. It means a lot in my life, really. And I actually love, when I went to London, I gave up concert going and took to the opera because I preferred the singing. Also, the stories. I mean, suddenly music in this form seemed wonderful to me. And so when I was asked to do an opera, the first one was in England, and when they first asked me, I thought I couldn't do it. I said no. I said, I think you have to know quite a bit about things to do it. I don't really have the technical knowledge about the theatre, nor I don't know about the music. And they said to me, oh, artists are very adaptable, intelligent people. You could get round this, and I
But they're not
instinctively
very good
believed
at collaboration. And that is one of the parts of that role that particularly interests me. To begin with, I wonder if you can tell us what kind of research you do, how
Well,
your
you have to
approach to
remember-
set design
You have to remember
differs from...
this when you say they're not good at collaboration. If you're collaborating with Stravinsky and Mozart and Ravel, you're very privileged. You're collaborating with first-class artists and wonderful artists. It should humble you a little bit, I think, really. You think, well, he's written the music, which is going to be much better than anything I do for it. So that makes you collaborate.
Were there any special problems or challenges that came with the collaboration?
Well, the first thing that always the problem for me is, for instance, when I agreed to do the Stravinsky opera, which I think is the best opera ever written in Hollywood. It was written here in 1948, 49.
Have there been many
It
others?
was the story. Pardon?
Do you think there have been many other operas that have been
Written in Hollywood. I don't know, actually. I do know that. I have no idea. But it was the story and the words attracted me greatly. And then I said, well, I'll listen to the music. When I first listen to the music, I must admit I didn't get too much from it. And when I was told it was one of the great scores of the 20th century, I just thought, well, I'm not hearing it. And it took me about 10 listenings to actually get it, I must admit. And maybe my ear is slow. But I grew to love it, absolutely love it. Then I did a magic flute. Well, that I wanted to do. I'd love to do it again, actually. I think sublime work, great sublime work. I love its message, I love its music. It can be done many ways. The designer, after all, is very important in it. You can ruin it.
How would you do it again and otherwise?
Well, another theatre. I'd love to do it at the Met, actually. But they've got a Chagall one, which some people like and some people don't.
In what way does your approach to set design differ from your approach to painting?
Well, in the theatre, everything, it seems to me, has to make the work one. Whatever you're doing, after all, you take a work that was written by two people, say the librettist and a musician, and if it's really good, on the whole, you see, for instance, in Parade, the one I thought was the best piece musically and affected me the most was Ravel's very charming L'Enfant et le Sortilège. When I first listened to that music, I thought, oh, it's charming. But again, after about 8 listenings, I discovered it was sublime. It's the most beautiful piece of music ever written, practically. Even knowing Mozart, I think that. But and then I just got turned on, completely turned on. And in a way, everything, the inspiration comes from the music. It gives you something, you see. I mean, that's why I like working in the musical theatre more than, I mean, I've only done one thing in an ordinary theatre.
What was that?
Au Bourgeois, did. But I mean, I'm giving it up for the time being because the trouble is it takes me too long. I spend far too long on them, really. I think other designers do them quicker or they know how to do it or something. I tend to get too involved and think it should, you know,
Does it
for
require
instance,
a great deal of research on your part?
well, a lot of listening. Yeah, I mean, I read up everything I can find about them and old performances. Yeah, I do all that. But listening to the music is the thing, and you have to listen really. You know, concentrate and sit and listen, and so you get to know them very well.
You said you were giving it up for the time being. Does that mean you plan to do it again?
Well, no, I've spent the last 2 years, really, working in the theatre, and I haven't done that much painting. It took up a lot of time, and all the paintings I did were related to the things I do in the theatre. But in the theatre, you see, I'd steal in a way that you might not for your own painting. I mean, in the end, when we did the Ravel piece, I stole the colours outright from one painting of Matisse, but I thought they were perfect with the music. That's what the music was about in this. It's full of colour, the music's full of colour, and those were the colours. So I hope Matisse didn't mind. I stole them, and now, you see, I probably wouldn't have done that in my own painting when I'm, in a way, giving myself things to do. But you see, the theatre, you're given a lot of things to work with. But I find that the restrictions naturally stimulate your imagination. You can, you know, when you're told you have to have 36 people in the middle of the stage and they're singing, and then there's got to be a garden and there's got to be other things. Goodness me, all you're going to do is look at 36 people in the middle of the
colorful you are. There's something actually that I've been meaning to ask you, and that is that I liken both your colorful approach to fashion and actually your hair to Nevelson's eyelashes, neither of which I imagine is accidental. What did prompt you to paint your hair?
I thought I just looked better as a blonde. I cannot be bothered.
Where did you get the idea in the first place?
From a TV ad.
Saying?
Said blondes have more fun.
Do they?
Well, I've nothing to compare it with now, only the life before. It's been more fun, yes. Anyway, it's just you invent your own face, don't you?
I think so. Many viewers hold you responsible for inventing and developing a visual vocabulary for California as well. Again, with its unique shapes and sense of light and shadow, you did learn those lessons early on. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
What?
That whole California vocabulary. In fact, you've been likened to expressing visually about California, for example, what Mom would about the Riviera.
I've started painting it a bit differently now, only because I'm seeing it a bit differently. Looking, as I say, the wiggly lines are getting stronger. There's other ways of looking, really, that I'm getting interested in. But I mean, I think the vocabulary you have to develop is big, so long as you keep making it bigger. That's what's marvelous about the late Picasso. In the end, he used the vocabulary he'd been making all his life, and that's what's so stunning about them and why he can make things real, I think. So you simply go on trying to enrich it and enrich it. Well, you do, and most people do.
Suddenly one day you awakened to find yourself very much acclaimed in a way perhaps that might have surprised even you by the media. Did you ever expect your work to be celebrated the way it was and so quickly?
Well, it wasn't overnight, really. I always, painters, it's slow, and I mean, I always thought my pictures were too expensive. Even when they were £100, I thought, I daren't tell anybody they cost £100, and it was far too much. And I started making a living at painting, you see, just after I left art school. And I thought that was fantastic. If you could actually make a living doing painting, that was wonderful to me. I didn't mind if it wasn't too much money. And I think I don't know, it's kind of a privilege to be an artist, it seems to me, because artists, after all, you never meet an artist who wants to be anything else, ever. Which means you might meet a lot of other people who are doing something who want to be artists, don't they? It seems like, in a way, the best way to live, seems to me. So if you can do it anyway, I mean, it doesn't matter if you haven't too much money, it's still wonderful. Most people would want the money to get a lot of money so that they could become like that in the first place. They don't know you don't need much.
Did you ever expect your life to unfold the way it has?
Well, I don't look into the future too much, really. I mean, of course, my own vision of myself is different from yours, perhaps. I think, I don't know, I tend to think I'm not really, I tend to think naturally that pictures would get better in the future, they'll be better. They're not really that good, and So, you know, you tend to see yourself a certain way, and
How would you describe your work?
changing. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Well, the constant things, I suppose, are simply always dealing with whatever experience comes along. Sometimes, of course, you manipulate the experience to happen, and sometimes you don't. And both can be subjects, I think. But that's what it is. That's the constant continuity in it, really.
Well, for providing us with an experience that we will all long remember, and sharing with us ideas that are as fresh and as thoughtful as your work. Very special thanks to you, David Hockney. It was a very special evening for all of us. Do you want questions? Yes. For those of you who'd like to stay for a moment, it's now time for the audience to join in the conversation as well. And if you have a friendly and focused question and would care to ask David Hockney, if you would be good enough to raise your hand, I will call upon you, the woman in the first row.
Yes, I understand another Yorkshire man.
Can you hear the question? I'll repeat it if you can't.
All right, would you repeat it?
Why don't you say it?
Sir Henry Moore is another Yorkshire man as well, and his art, he did teach at Leeds College, did he not?
Sorry, he
Taught at Leeds.
leads, yes.
And do you feel that his work influenced you or his style, because you do come from the same background?
Has everyone heard the question? It relates to Henry Moore, who also comes from Yorkshire, and the question was, was Mr. Hockney influenced
By Henry Moore.
the work of Henry Moore,
Well,
or any similarity?
I think he's a wonderful artist, Henry Moore. The smaller the sculptures are, the more I like them, seem to me. The bigger they are, the very big ones get pompous in a way a bit. But he comes from a very similar background to me, it's true. He comes from Castleford. It's about 20 miles from Bradford. And I think his father was a school teacher or something. In fact, once when I met him, he said how, even though it was about 60 years before, he said the life wouldn't have been too different then. But I don't think he's influenced me in any style at all, because in fact till recently I've never been that interested in sculpture really. But I think his he might actually be exerting some small influence now. I keep seeing things that I hadn't seen before in his work, actually. Slowly I noticed, I made the point now that I think when the smaller they are, the more, the better they are somehow. But there's certainly no direct influence, though, in that way.
Are there any other questions? Joel Wax, did you have your hand up? No? Was there a question? Yes, the woman.
When you're involved in your work and you're moving, from one style of drawing to another, or from one subject matter to another, do you just sort of follow your fascinations, or do you make really intellectual decisions about what you're going to address yourself to in your work?
Well, I work in many different ways, you see, sometimes. For instance, when you're just painting on your own, you do what you want. The painter in the studio is the freest person in the world, in a way. I mean, he just makes his painting, and you just have to get somebody to look at it. I mean, the composers to get somebody to play it. It's wonderful. And painting, you tend to, of course, you can begin with one idea and change it. Can't you just throw it out and you paint, you just go on. I mean, it's always discovering in painting. Sometimes I would begin paintings with a very clear idea of what I wanted to do and even try and do it. But that was for a very short time, and I realized it's not really a good way to paint for me. On the other hand, when sometimes, as I pointed out, when you're given a lot of things, for instance, working in the theatre, where you have to work with people who say, well, you can't put the singer there because the sound wouldn't be right and you need something at the back to reflect the sound. You have to take notice of all these things and still try and do something that's fresh and lively. So it's a different, then you have to work quite differently, but I think it's rather good for you at times. I've enjoyed the limitations being imposed. I mean, when you've no limitations, usually a painter does it himself, of course, doesn't he? I mean, if you make a line drawing, you're deciding you're going to make representations and feelings of something using only line. You choose that limitation, and usually the fewer lines you can use, often the better, isn't it? I mean, after all, if you were said you could use 100 lines to draw something, and then you're saying now you can use 20 lines to draw something, you have to be more imaginative to use the 20, and it's always more stimulating now. So,
Here, one last question. The man against the wall.
You've worked in so many different mediums, drawing and lithography and painting and theater, and you've worked in so many different approaches to each of those mediums. And what I was wondering is if the idea takes you to the way that you're going to treat it, or if you find yourself fascinated with a new way of working and ideas come out of a new way of working.
well, it's a bit of both, really. As I say, in the theatre, you've things to. You listen to music, you read a story, you interpret that. I love new mediums, I must admit. I think all artists rather like new mediums, or anyway, an artist of my type. I mean, after all, a lot of artists, you see, I tend to admire, the reason I admire Picasso is he wouldn't be afraid of doing anything. He'd take on any job, anything somehow. He'd think, well, you can do something with it. Well, a lot of artists, after all, tend to do the opposite. They think, and quite rightly for some, I'm sure, they think, no, it's better if I concentrate on a smaller area and look into it deeply and do that. But I mean, I'm not that type of person. I like different kinds of experience. I mean, you simply have them. Reading a poem, I mean, is a very different experience from looking at a landscape in a way. Looking at a landscape might inspire you to do something, but it's, between your eyes and some object in a way, whereas the way a poem might inspire you is sounds and ideas. I mean, it's a completely different thing, isn't it? And I must admit, I like the idea that experience is varied, and so in art it should be, really. It is varied in everyday life, isn't it? But then other things come in, just sheer love of new medium. I mean, it's only since working, for instance, at the having to fill the stage of the Metropolitan Opera, which must be the biggest stage, practically the biggest stage in the world of any theatre. It's made me, for the first time, think of actually doing some sculpture, because it never occurred to me before, but you see, space filling becomes a part of what you're having to do, which is not the same on a painting. I mean, it's a different kind of space, and it's still only at the back of my head. When
But
it
you've
gets to
made
the
two
front, when it gets
references
to the
to it this evening. Perhaps it's moving.
well, it's moving up.
More.
Yeah, it's moving to the front, and then I'll do something about it. But you know, only when it's strong will I do it. But I'm sure it was that experience that triggered things I'd never thought about. You see, just a
Thank you, David Hockney, and thank you, audience, for being with us. Yeah.